Well, good morning. Thank you very much, Leslie, and thank you all for getting up at this early hour to start out on our third day of the People's Response. And we want to thank Leslie and all of you all who have been a part of putting this four-day challenge to the Bush administration, the challenge to the legacy of George Bush, the challenge of us as citizens continuing in our effort to hold accountable a President of the United States and his cabinet, of his Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, his National Security Advisor, those people who were involved in criminal acts committed as U.S. government officials. And as Leslie said, I was in the U.S. government for most of my adult life, first in the military for 29 years and then as a U.S. diplomat for 16 years. So I've been a part of our government during the times that many bad things happen in the name of our government. I finally resigned in opposition to the war in Iraq, but it could have and probably should have been a resignation much earlier, and it could have been on a variety of issues. Those issues that you all as citizens over those many, many years were out on the street challenging. You were challenging the Vietnam War. You were challenging the wars in Central America that the United States was sponsoring. You challenged Gulf War I. You challenged going into Afghanistan, where I was. I helped reopen the U.S. Embassy in December of 2001 and was there until April of 2002. And then I did resign in March of 2003 in opposition to the war on Iraq. That war that 10 years ago that the United States, the U.S. government, George Bush and his team decided that we, the United States, would attack, invade, occupy an oil-rich Arab Muslim country that had nothing to do with 9/11, that had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, but a war of choice, violation of international law. And yet that's what George Bush and his team did. And to you as the citizens, as you were out on the streets marching before the war, marching to say no to that war, and the largest demonstrations, at least in this millennium, is that right? Millennium? Decade? Yeah, the largest ones that we know of, the
Century.
Anti-war protests in our country and in the countries of all around the world. So the people were right. The people's response was right to challenge the Bush administration, the Blair administration, all of these administrations that had been arm-twisted to go to war. And as we saw that war, first in Afghanistan and then later on in Iraq, as the United States invaded and occupied countries. And then we saw, while I was still in Afghanistan, we saw the first prisoners coming out of the war on Afghanistan. Except most of those prisoners weren't from Afghanistan. Most of those prisoners weren't even captured. They were purchased by the United States of America in a bounty program. And over the next 2 years, over 800 people were purchased by the United States of America in a bounty program where people were turning in their enemies. They were turning in people they didn't like in their villages. They were selling off people of other nationalities that they saw on the streets of Pakistan. And so for a Taliban, somebody that could convince the United States government and its operatives, none of whom could speak Dari, Pashto, or any of the languages of that region, and using interpreters that perhaps had access to grind too, the United States of America would pay $5,000 for somebody that you could convince a U.S. government official was a Taliban. $5,000. That guy right over there, Taliban. $5,000, I need my money. If you could convince the United States operatives that this was an Al-Qaeda person, a senior Al-Qaeda, you might be able to get $25,000 for that. So in 2001 and 2002 and 2003, there were all sorts of people being turned into the United States and being sent to the prisons in Afghanistan being sent to the prison now in Guantanamo, where the United States decided it would abrogate its laws. It would create a prison on a military base in a country that the United States had held the territory for now over 100 years, in Cuba, where the United States created secret prisons all over the world. We don't even still know all of the places the United States was rendering people. You know, the terminology now that we have in our lexicon, the terminologies of torture, the terminology of kidnapping somebody off the streets, kidnapping them, beating them up, torturing them, putting them on an airplane, extraordinary rendition, flying them someplace in the world where the United States had worked with governments, many of which had inherently despicable legal systems and prison systems that in our human rights reports that the United States government publishes, the United States had already said these people torture, these governments torture people, and then the United States goes ahead and sends people that we had purchased to those countries so that they could be tortured. And we now know from just a report that was issued just this last week from the Constitution Project, a bipartisan group with some very senior neocons in it, including Asa Hutchinson, a former congressperson from the state of Arkansas, and then a man who was a part of Homeland Security. He was on this commission, the Constitution Project, and in a damning 577-page report where he, in a press conference, he finally said, you know, I didn't really believe the United States had done all the things it had been accused of until all of the documents were laid out in front of me. Well, he's about 10 years too late. I mean, we all saw those documents. We've been seeing those documents for years. But now in a bipartisan report, it's laid out there. It's laid out that the United States torturing people in Abu Ghraib, torturing people in Bagram Air Base, torturing people in the salt pits of Afghanistan. And then, as we know from the news now, that men who have been in prison in Guantanamo for over 10 years, 12 years now actually, if they went in January 11th of 2002 when the first plane-load of prisoners were sent from Afghanistan into Guantanamo. And these suits that you all are wearing, these suits reminding us that over 800 people have been in Guantanamo alone, and that right now there are 167 people left in Guantanamo. And over half of them now are on hunger strikes, because of the conditions that the United States has kept them in. Well over 2/3 of the people in Guantanamo have already been designated for release. Most of them designated for release under the Bush administration, and yet 5 years into Obama's administrations, they're still being held there. And that's one of the reasons why they're on a hunger strike, as well as the continuing problem of U.S. military folks that are there as prison guards who are being disrespectful to the Quran, to the holy book of Islam. And another time when U.S. military have gone in and taken the private scriptures of the men that are there and in whatever way desecrating them. I don't know quite what are the allegations. The U.S. military says we had to go in because we wanted to see what was inside the book. Well, you can probably figure that out. A lot of pages. And as we know that there are security cameras that have been watching every single move of every single one of these prisoners for a decade now. A decade. We know that there have been 3 prisoners that the United States has said have committed suicide. 3 prisoners in one night. The torture of what's been going on there, and the lies that have been coming out of the U.S. administrations, the Bush administration and the Obama administration. But on that night, I believe it was 2006, that night when we were told that 3 people committed suicide on the same night. On the same night. And then as prison guards, as they got out of the military and then started talking about what had been going on in Guantanamo, that we now know from a sergeant who was in charge of one of the facilities. He was watching all the cameras and he saw a car pull up to one the facility where these 3 guys were being kept, and 3 people were taken to another facility. And about 3 hours later, the van came back to that first facility. And then at dawn, there was an alert. Something's happened in that facility. And we are told now that those 3 men hung themselves. They hung themselves with their hands behind their back, and as this sergeant says, and socks stuffed into their mouths. Well, that's impossible to do, you know, with your own hands behind your back, and then you hang yourself. I mean, the murders that have gone on, the emotional, psychological torture of keeping people in these prisons under these types of conditions. So as we are here in these orange suits that are now notorious, I mean, while there are orange suits that many prisoners wear in various facilities in the United States, I mean, how many of you all have been arrested for peaceful nonviolent protests and have been put in one of these orange jumpsuits someplace in the United States? How many of you all have? 2 or 3? Well, these are pretty common. In fact, I was arrested in the U.S. Congress one time. Well, many times, but one time in particular, we were there to protest torture. And in fact, we were protesting the nomination of one of the architects of torture, one of the guys who had written the memos for authorizing the enhanced interrogation techniques to be used on prisoners. And Addington, one of the lawyers for Dick Cheney, and Jim Haynes, and Jay Bybee being nominated and being confirmed as a federal court judge now. We have a torturer who has a lifetime appointment as a federal court judge. His buddy, Jim Haynes, who is the general counsel of the Department of Defense, the chief civilian lawyer of the Department of Defense, had been nominated also by the Bush administration to be one of the federal court judges. And with his nomination, several of us were out in front of the Dirksen building. There was a mock waterboarding that was held outside, trying to get publicity for the fact that there was a torturer that was being, the confirmation hearing for Jim Haynes was being held that day. And after we finished the waterboarding, there were 3 of us that kept on our orange jumpsuits, and we walked into the Dirksen building. And you know, the guards at the Dirksen building have seen us come into that building in a variety of outfits over the years. And we've had lawsuits on what t-shirts we can wear, what outfits we can have on, how high we can hold signs, all of this sort of thing. So we knew that we could wear an orange jumpsuit into that building. And when we walked into the Judiciary Committee hearing on Jim Haynes, and at the time, Arlen Specter was the head of the Judiciary Committee. And I can remember so vividly, as we walked in, the hearing had already started. And as we walked in, you could see Arlen Specter's eyes starting to get bigger and bigger and bigger as these orange jumpsuits started walking into that hearing room for one of the architects of torture. And as the proceeding went on, where the senators laud the person that's been nominated. This man has worked so long for the Department of Defense. He's an extraordinary lawyer. He's protected our troops. He's done all of this stuff. And then after they get through with it, then it's time for the nominee to speak. And so when Jim Haynes started speaking, I thought, well, this is a good time to let the people know what we think about this. So as he was speaking, I went close to him and said, I'm a retired Army colonel, and I think this man has jeopardized the national security of our country because of the torture that he's done. The torture, the memos. You cannot confirm this man this torture as a federal court judge. Well, as we know, we don't get much time as you're speaking out in front of the Congress and in the hearing. And it didn't take long before Arlen Specter started with his gavel, pounding and pounding. Stop, stop, remove that woman, stop, stop. And I guess I should have been arrested about 4 times for the number of times that he pounded that gavel. But you know, do you remember what happened? Do you remember what happened? He was not confirmed. He was not confirmed. Yeah. So, who knows what our going into that hearing room did? But we do know that it very vividly showed to the U.S. Congress that we don't want a torturer or another torturer that's a federal court judge. You know, we were down in Guantanamo. There were 10 of us that went to Guantanamo in 2007. We were a delegation to go to the back side, to the back gates of Guantanamo, to be there as citizen diplomats to say, we don't want this prison here in Cuba to be existing. And we brought with us, we asked Reprieve, which is an organization in the UK, Reprieve and another group called Caged Prisoners. They have done so much work in highlighting the plight of the prisoners and in working with families whose loved ones are in the prison. And then as people had been released from the prison, working with them to try to help them readjust to life without wearing these suits. So we contacted them and told them we were taking this delegation to Guantanamo. And did they know of anyone who had been released from the prison who might want to go with us? You know, thinking, no way in the world will anybody who's been released ever go back. Well, you remember the movie called The Road to Guantanamo, about the 4 guys that had flown to Pakistan for a wedding, then decided crazily to go into Afghanistan. It just happened to be as the United States started its bombing in Afghanistan. Well, those 3 of the guys survived, but were sent to the Guantanamo prison. One of them had been released, and the movie called The Road to Guantanamo. He came with us. He came with us with the producer of that movie. We also asked Reprieve, are there any relatives of people who are still in Guantanamo who might want to go with us? A man by the name of Omar Dagayas was in that prison. He was a British resident from Libya, actually. His father had been killed in Libya by Muammar Gaddafi, years before, and his mom and the four siblings had moved to London. He had gone to Afghanistan on a humanitarian mission. He had been picked up, he had been sold by people actually in Pakistan. He had gone from Afghanistan into Pakistan. He had been sold in the bounty program. Omar Dagayas' mother and brother said, we want to go. We want to go with you. And it was so poignant to be at the back gate of Guantanamo with the mother and the brother of somebody that was in that prison right then. We had quite a few media that were there, interestingly enough. We had big media trucks that had gone all the way out from Havana, all the way. I mean, Cuba is a long country. It had taken, 2 days for that truck actually to go out there. But we had live news broadcasts that were going from the backside of Guantanamo, that were broadcasting all over the world, that there were citizens of the United States and a few from other countries that were there to protest what was going on in Guantanamo. And I remember vividly when Taher Dagayas, the brother of Omar, was doing an interview with Al Jazeera. And just as he finished the interview, his cell phone rang, and it was friends of his in Dubai that had seen him live on that newscast, live from the back gates of Guantanamo. Omar was released finally a year later, blind in one eye then. and still suffering now, 6 years later, from major emotional trauma and physical trauma. What we've done in the name of protection of the United States, the torture, the extraordinary rendition, the lies that have been told by the Bush administration, are reasons that we are here to hold accountable this Bush administration for the crimes that it has committed. I'll just finish my part of this by saying that last night we went on a little mission. We went on a little mission over to the George Bush Library and Institute, the think tank, the stink tank. And Colleen Rowley, former FBI agent, retired FBI agent, drove one of the getaway cars, and Wright, retired colonel, drove another getaway car. And inside those two cars, we had people who had a big projection screen, or a big projector, two big projectors. This was part of Bill Moyer's and the Backbone campaign. And we had Nathan that was there filming, we had Dennis Traynor that was there filming, and as the guys got out with these big projections, and I was thinking, oh Christ, you know, this is maybe one of the stupidest things we've ever done. 2 days before all the living presidents of the United States are coming to this building, and we here at 2 in the morning are getting out of cars with electric lines running from batteries out the car, and two guys with these big black objects pointing at a building. It kind of gave me a little bit of an eerie feeling, but I'll tell you, when all of a sudden the lights came on these projectors, and those words that came up, lies and torture, Bush, lies and torture, when those were projected on the walls of his institute, it was like, I don't care, you all just come and arrest all of us, because it's needed up there. So those photos ought to be going up online any moment now. We didn't get back to the house till about 3 o'clock, and after a little celebratory time to thank our lucky stars we didn't get zapped. Anyway, it's part of what we are here to do, and we're here to learn more about our history so we can prevent it from happening again. We have a second administration of the Obama administration that is allowing people to be indefinitely detained, that is curtailing our civil liberties in ways that George Bush started and being continued by Barack Obama.